Today, we're diving into a terrain project I've wanted to tackle forever. I first got into painting models during the end of 2nd edition Warhammer 40,000, but it was 3rd edition where my early hobby journey truly began. That era marked a major visual shift, not just in the miniatures, but in the terrain as well. The aesthetic leaned heavily into realism. Dense ruins, jungle terrain, and atmospheric battlefields completely captured my imagination. The starter set came with a few plastic ruins and a small set of jungle trees, but as a kid I could never afford to build a full table like the ones in the magazines. After 25 years, it's finally time to take on this long overdue project. We're building a Warhammer 3rd edition style jungle table, using a ton of those classic plastic jungle trees and painting up a Realm of Battle game board to match. For the past few months, I've been collecting jungle tree kits on eBay. Some are still brand new in their original packaging. Others are partially built, and some are just loose sprues. I've been gathering as many as I can because to get a proper jungle feel, we're going to need a lot of them. Now, while the table is inspired by 3rd edition, the Realm of Battle board actually came out during 5th edition Warhammer 40,000. This set was designed to be system agnostic and was promoted for both Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000. Let's start our project with the Realm of Battle tiles. We are going to follow similar methods shown in White Dwarf issue 348 and use mostly period-correct materials to stay true to that era's look and feel, but with a modernized, more realistic touch to better suit the Horus Heresy and to blend more seamlessly with the rest of my terrain collection. We start with spray cans. First, I use Rust-Oleum Flat Black to prime all of our Realm of Battle tiles, giving them a solid, even coat that will serve as the foundation for all future layers. Next, I lay down our base brown using Rust-Oleum Satin Nutmeg, applying it in a nice, even coat across all the tiles. Once that's dry, I switch to Mechanicum Standard Gray and spray all the rock edges. It's totally fine if this step isn't perfect, because I go back in with the nutmeg to tighten up the edges and blend the gray into the brown for a more natural transition. To finish the spray can stage, I apply a light overspray of Rust-Oleum Satin Fossil to add some tonal variation and visual interest to the brown areas. With the spray can stage complete, you can already see the table coming together nicely with the major colors blocked in. Now, it's time to switch over to the airbrush. Using Vallejo Neutral Gray, I do a highlight over all of our gray rock facings. This layer will bring out the depth on our rocks and help them stand out. I switch to Vallejo US Arena and Concrete and add more tonal variation. I use these two similar colors at once during this stage, switching between each color to add natural variation. I also tighten and blend our previous gray layer into the brown. Switching to Vallejo Light Gull Gray, I add the final highlight to our rocks. Don't worry if they seem a bit too bright at this stage. Everything will be toned down and blended later when we get to powders. With our main airbrush stage done, it's time to turn to the notorious skull pits. I use Vallejo FX Dark Earth and fill in the pits. This will turn this cartoony feature into something that adds a high level of realism by making them look like natural vernal pools. When the ponds are filled, I dab them with a wet paper towel to dampen them down. I let them dry for a day and then use Vallejo NATO Green to begin blending them into the table. This will look like minor plant life. I finish the blend with Vallejo Concrete and blend everything to have a more natural edge. Now it's time to add weathering powders. The primary powders I use are Eptyling Ochre Earth and Desert Sand. I apply a splotchy coat of these powders across the entire board. Yellow powders often look way more yellow than the desired result, but once sealed will look very different. Once I have the table covered in these two powders, I switch to Eptyling Europe Dust and apply another layer of this darker brown powder to the edges of the rocks and areas where I want to replicate more damp dirt. Once the table is entirely powdered, I use Rust-Oleum Matte Clear and seal the entire table. The powders mix into the varnish and give the table a very natural tint. You can see a lot of the yellows are heavily toned down after being sealed. This is the same process I used on my Desert Realm of Battle tables, shown in some of the battle reports in this channel. And if I were adding to that collection, this is where I would finish. To add more elevation and line of sight blocking, we are going to add a 2-pack of Warhammer Hills. These originally came out in 2004 and were packaged as a single hill. We are also going to add the large Warhammer hill. The large hill is modular and can be assembled into a single big hill, or broken up into half hills to be set on a table edge. While these came out years before the Realm of Battle, the designers used the same style rock edges and texture to ensure they work together seamlessly. I'll paint these off camera using the same steps previously used on the Realm of Battle. Moving on to our next stage, I turn to our static grass and classic green flock. To apply these, I start by brushing PVA glue onto sections of the board. I first sprinkle on some classic GW flock to replicate very small plant cover. I then switch to my static grass applicator and drop a layer of grass over the top. I repeat this process throughout the tiles. I have a limited amount of these period-correct materials and want to spread that iconic green evenly throughout the tiles to get that classic look, but also to preserve the table's modularity. After I get my layer down, I let everything dry before shaking the tiles off and saving the flock for the next layer. I then use a shop vacuum and suck up any loose grass on the table before moving on to the second stage of flocking. I use Woodland Scenic's Scenic Cement and spray it onto the spaces between our first layer and add more flock. The Scenic Cement is very watery and will soak into our first flock layer as well. It's very important to seal all the flock in place, or the table will shed throughout its lifetime. I begin working in different color flocks to add more natural variation and make our table look more realistic. When the table is mostly dry, I turn to our various collection of tufts. I focus on the areas at the base of the rock edges because water would naturally catch in these areas, encouraging plant growth. Being between the rocks, the tufts will be safe during regular gameplay and when the table is stored. For the vernal ponds, I used a dried dead grass. I imagine these grasses would turn green as the ponds naturally fill with the water. With our flock layer complete, I let everything dry for a few days. If needed, you can apply more layers of scenic cement over the top to further hold everything down. While everything dries, it's a good time to talk about this video's sponsor, Flexispot. I've wanted an E7 Plus for the studio for a while, but not for the usual reasons you get a standing desk, like ergonomic and comfort benefits. Instead, I'm using it as a dedicated filming workspace. The E7 Plus has a 540-pound static weight capacity, even higher than its competitor, the Uplift V2. I had a lot of fun stress testing that, but the real game changer for Heresy Era is how it functions as a filming surface. I shoot all my intros and cutscenes with motion control equipment, gear that's heavy, awkward, and a pain to raise, lower, and level between shots. The Flexispot E7 solves that by letting me keep the camera fixed and stable and instead adjust the subject. The motors are even smooth enough that I can use the desk itself to simulate jib movements. This is the tallest four-leg standing desk you can buy, lifting over 51 inches. It's also more budget-friendly than other desks in the same performance category. The control pad has a built-in USB charger, which I use to power small lights and batteries, and I added the optional caster wheels so I can move the desk freely around the studio. If you're interested in a Flexispot desk for a painting or production surface, check out their website, link in the description. Flexispot has an impressive 15-year warranty and even offers discounts for military, students, doctors, and more. And if you use my code, you'll get $50 off your order. With our table dry, let's move on to our jungle trees. My loose eBay trees need some prep before I can use them. Many were broken and I had to drill them out. It was a little annoying, but I need as many as I can get, and this was well worth the time. Opening these new old stock trees felt a little sacrilegious. The gray plastic ones are the later release of these trees that GW sold before discontinuing them. These colored plastic Wargames terrain packaged ones are the earlier release. With our sprues organized, we can move on to making bases. For our bases, I like MDF because it can be cut into different shapes, and you can easily bevel the edges with a hobby knife, giving everything a smoother transition onto our game board. With the edges trimmed out, I arranged the loose tree bases onto our MDF to get an idea of overall coverage and figure out how dense we can go with the amount of trees I have on hand. To further thicken things out, I have something super exciting. These were designed by the talented Stephen May at Dead Earth Miniatures and printed by my friends at Hangar 81. Stephen worked at Specialist Games as a miniature designer and has made some of my favorite Necromunda sculpts. I linked his website in the description. These are based off the iconic 2nd edition cactus balls, but modernized to be more realistic. These are going to work perfect for this project. I've arranged the cacti into natural clumps and will surround them with the palm trees to make everything look integrated. I also like to think that the trees will sort of frame in the cacti and prevent their fragile little spikes from damage during gameplay. With my coverage established, I use taxidermy putty to start working everything into the bases. Taxidermy putty is cheaper than green stuff, and you can buy it in big tubs. I use it to work my tree bases into the MDF and create little mounds. I then use aluminum foil. I just make it into a punch and hit all of the putty. This will make everything look more like dirt and make a better texture for our flock to glue into. I put the cacti into the putty and will pop them off after everything dries. I'll paint them separate and later glue them back in place. With this stage done, the putty needs to cure for a few hours before I can move on to the next step. I glue on some gravel between our trees, and then I finish everything with a nice coat of Vallejo FX earth texture to blend it all together. Off camera, I use the same methods as the Realm of Battle table to paint our Warhammer hills and tree bases. I use the same sprays and air paints for most of the process, except I did use Citadel Contrast Snakebite Leather to spray all of our tree bases. Contrast paint is awesome through an airbrush. The contrast paint gives our tree bases a darker color and naturally allows me to blend everything into the earth tone. I also used Vallejo Goblin Green to give a little spray of green onto the used tree bases that came with some foliage already glued on. I switched to Rust-Oleum Brown and spray all of our loose tree stems. I start with the loose ones and then move on to the ones still on sprue. I then switch to our leaves and spray them all with Rust-Oleum Matte Black to give them a nice dark primer. I then switch to Rust-Oleum Moss Green and give the loose and new on sprue leaves a green base coat. I switch to the airbrush and hit all of the leaves with Vallejo Goblin Green to add some variation to our green. I then finish by using Orc Flesh Contrast Paint. This will blend our previous two layers and add a very natural green gradient to our leaves. To paint our cacti, I start with Vallejo Air Maduri Green and give them a nice green base over their black undercoat. I purposefully apply a thicker coat on raised area of the cacti and leave thinner coats on other parts. I switch to Vallejo Goblin Green and give the cacti another coat. Like the previous layer, I go for about 80% coverage, still leaving some of the Midori green showing. I then switch to a brush and use Citadel Corn Red and paint all of the spikes. This was a pretty time-consuming step. I then use Citadel Mephiston Red and give the spikes a quick dry brush highlight. I remember doing this as a kid, painting toothpicks jammed into a foam ball. I flocked the tree bases and Warhammer hills in the same manner as the Realm of Battle table, and let them dry for a day before moving on to gluing our cacti on. The cacti are different sizes, and it was pretty easy to match them up to the indentations created into the taxidermy putty. Once all the cacti were glued on, I returned to the airbrush with snakebite leather and airbrush a light blending layer onto the cacti. This will add a brown gradient to our greens and give them a very natural and organic look. I then start building the GW jungle trees. It's pretty easy to figure out how to assemble them. They are an older design and a bit brittle, so I don't want to build them too tall. Thankfully, I had enough kits to fill out all of my trees. Once the trees are assembled, I transition to the airbrush and add a highlight of Vallejo Goblin Green. I take this opportunity to spray over any clipping marks from the leaves that were clipped out of their sprues. Once the Goblin Green highlight is done, I return to Citadel Snakebite Leather Contrast and give all my trees a blending layer. I spray this both on the tree trunks and the leaves. Spraying on the trunks will darken them and blend them into the bases. The layer on the leaves will give them that same natural gradient we added to the cacti. Our table is finished and ready for a game of Horus Heresy. Thanks again to Flexispot, Steven at Dead Earth Miniatures, Hanger81, and all of you for watching. Stay tuned for more painting guides and the upcoming cinematic battle report.